Joining us now to break down climate change from Los Angeles is a well-known American educator and commentator, Bill Nye. He also hosted a popular American television show, Bill Nye, the Science Guy. Bill, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
There's been so much talk lately about climate change. We hear terms like global warming, climate change, greenhouse effect, and it can all get very confusing. What is it that people need to know about climate change?
Well, it's happening. The world's getting warmer, disrupting weather patterns and more broadly climate patterns, that is yearly or multi-year patterns, because we have 7.2 billion people living and burning and breathing an atmosphere that's very thin compared to the size of the Earth. You know, if you had an extraordinary car and some crazy extraordinary road, and you could drive straight up for an hour, you'd be in outer space. So the problem is we have 7.2 billion people all trying to make a living, and we're changing the composition of the atmosphere so that it holds in more heat. And it's not just that it holds in more heat, we're doing it faster than ever in the history of the Earth. It's the speed that we're changing things that's going to get us.
So when you talk to skeptics and critics, a lot of them say, if we are experiencing this, why do we have such cold, frigid winters?
So, as we say, it's not just that the world's getting warmer, it's we're disrupting traditional climate patterns. And so what's happened, for example, last year is what I believe you're referring to in North America. Because of the changes in the atmosphere, the jet stream, which is this consequence of the spin of the Earth and the heating of the sun, this west to east wind dipped far farther south than it normally does, or than it used to. And so that allowed air from polar regions, from the Arctic regions, to find its way much farther south than it used to. And this could be a one-off pattern. It could happen just once, or it could be broadly the way the future is going to be, with much colder winters and hotter summers. These extremes are consistent with all the climate computer models that people have written so far.
So what would you tell these critics?
Well, I just remind them that they're on the fringe. That is to say, the scientific consensus that humans are causing climate change is somewhat stronger than the scientific consensus that cigarettes cause cancer, by about 1%. So the fossil fuel industry has worked very hard to introduce the idea that scientific uncertainty about certain events, what you might express as plus or minus a few percent, that somehow that plus or minus a few percent is equivalent or the same as doubt about the whole thing, that plus or minus a few percent is the same as zero. And that's wrong. And this has been the irony, I'm sure, in the coming decades. These people have kids and grandkids, and they're going to look back on this and regret it. But we have to work with, we all have to play the hand we're dealt right now.
So, Bill, what do we need to be doing as individuals, as communities, as nations?
Well, as I like to say, we have to do everything all at once. So the biggest effect that most of us have on the environment in the developed world is the car we drive, how we get around. So if you want to do something personally, get around less inefficiently, be more efficient. You've heard the story, taking public transportation, literally ride your bike, and drive less, combine errands, or get a more efficient car. You know, we have cars now that get 2.5, 3 times the gas mileage of cars that when I was growing up. And this is not through rocket surgery. This is just people being diligent about the design of cars. And so we can do great things. Then the other thing that as globally, or as voters and taxpayers, we really need regulations. We need to influence industries and all of us to do things more efficiently. And people used to complain about the Clean Water Act. This would be about 30 years ago. It turns out now everybody really prefers having clean water, that there's economic benefits to having clean water. People used to complain about regulations regarding wetlands or preservation of, or the protection of surface water, as it's called. Now everybody prefers not to have floods and not to build seawalls and dikes. So there are enormous economic opportunities. And then the other thing that I emphasize all the time is basic research. Whoever invents the better battery, if we had batteries that were capable of storing energy at the same level that we can store gasoline in gas tanks, it would utterly change the world. And I submit that somebody or some corporation or group of people is going to get crazy rich, going to get wealthy if that invention can be, or a set of inventions can be developed. And this, in my opinion, requires government investment in basic research at our universities and especially in elementary science education.
So Bill, why do you think this issue has become politicized to some extent?
Well, the fossil fuels, at least in North America, are created or drawn or produced, mined, from areas where have long traditions of conservative politics. And so people who live in cities are traditionally more progressive. People who live in rural areas are traditionally more conservative. And the coal and oil and natural gas are produced in these more conservative areas, and that's led to trouble. But there's also been a concerted effort on the fossil fuel industry to suppress the science of climate change. It's very well documented. And it's just, as I say, we got to play the hand we're dealt. As the tipping point is reached, which I think is very soon, where we had 300,000 people marching in Manhattan, a third of a million people in a major city. And there were, all around the world, there were millions of people in total marching to remind our governments of the importance of climate change. We're going to reach a tipping point akin to, for a guy my age, akin to the Vietnam War, where people just went, okay, enough, we're going to stop fighting this war. We're going to stop denying climate change. And when that happens, we've all got to work together. I don't want to get into vengeance or vindictiveness. We just all got to, let's just get going. Let's do all we can to mitigate the effects and prepare for the changes.
So I'm going to ask you a scientific question, and if you could explain it to me and our audience in the most simple terms so we can, we're not all experts like you are. The difference between climate change and an actual weather pattern, what's the difference here?
Well, you know the difference. We all know the difference. If you live in right now you're in Washington, D.C.,
Yes,
right?
sir.
Okay, so you know that the climate is what we call temperate. It gets to be a little below freezing in the winter and somewhat above freezing in the summer. It's humid where you are, but it rains in the wintertime once in a while. There are very dry periods in the wintertime. There are very dry periods in the summer. Then there are thunderstorms in the summer. Well, thunderstorms, hailstorms, snowstorms, those are weather patterns. The climate, what traditionally we call temperate climate, is the bigger picture, the longer term. People who live in the American Southwest live in deserts, but it rains there. They have weather predictions, weather reports. The climate is dry, but still they have weather. The same is true everywhere around the world. So what's changing is the climate, and that is going to carry along with it the weather. So any single weather event is very, very difficult to connect to a larger picture, decades long. In a decade, you'll have thousands of days. In a weather prediction, you'll have a couple or 3 days, sometimes 8 or 9 days. So the scales of the thing are literally a factor of 100 or even 1,000. So they're different sides of the same coin. This is very intuitive. And by the way, the extreme heat in 2012 in Texas has been connected succinctly to global climate change. That event was big enough where it could be shown that it was a result of climate change. But those events have to be, and by the way, they are getting bigger, so the connections will be more obvious.
And there have been so many predictions. What is your prediction if something is not done about this issue?
Well, we'll have sea level rise. People in the developed world will have to leave seashores. You know, most of us live near the ocean around the world or on very large rivers. People have to move inland. Seawalls will have to be built. You know, Hurricane Sandy last year shut down New York City, and you can say, well, I don't live in New York City, I hate New York City. You can say that, but when you shut down such a large economy, it affects really, in that case, everybody in the world. So we're going to have to, people around the world are going to have to build defenses against flooding, just for example. Then crop production, let's say in North America, which is where we are, will move farther north. And this will be natural. This is to say, that's probably the wrong word in this context for deniers will seize on that. But people will notice that it doesn't rain as much, and they'll move their farming farther north. These will be corporations and families that farm for a living. Will move farther north, and parts of Canada will be more productive. These are not extraordinary claims. As I say, the scientific consensus on this is pretty robust.
Bill Nye, thank you so much, sir.
Let's change the world, people. Let's all get to work.
All right, thank you so much.